The rescue that changed everything. The sun hung high over the small town of Crestwood, casting golden reflections on the tranquil surface of Lake Avalon. The annual town picnic was in full swing, with families spread out on checkered blankets, enjoying the warmth of summer and the scent of barbecue wafting through the air. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter filling the air, while parents exchanged stories over plates piled high with grilled food. David Carter stood at the edge of the picnic crowd, his weathered hands tucked into the pockets of his faded jeans. He was in his late 30s, an ex-military man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor. Though he had been a part of this town for years, he had always felt a quiet disconnect, as if he were an observer rather than a participant in these gatherings. He watched the scene unfold with a sense of peace, but also a hint of loneliness. His gaze instinctively scanned the surroundings, a habit ingrained from years of service. That was when he noticed the little boy. A small child, no older than 4, had wandered from his family's picnic setup and toward the water's edge. His bright red t-shirt stood out against the green reeds and shimmering blue water. The boy, completely absorbed in the small family of ducks paddling nearby, leaned forward, his tiny fingers outstretched in curiosity. David's stomach twisted in an instant. The lake looked calm on the surface, but he knew from experience how deceptive that could be. The reeds near the shore were slippery, and the lakebed sloped quickly downward. If the boy lost his balance, David glanced around for the boy's parents. A woman, likely his mother, was busy setting up plates at a picnic table, unaware that her child had strayed too far. No one else seemed to notice. "Hey there, buddy," David called softly as he stepped forward, trying not to startle the child. The boy turned his head slightly, but his focus remained on the ducks. His small shoes slid just a fraction on the damp earth, and David's heart jumped into his throat. Then it happened. The boy's foot slipped on the mud. His arms flailed for balance, but it was too late. With a gasp, he tipped forward and disappeared into the water. A woman's scream shattered the air. Tyler, the boy's mother, Beth, had turned just in time to see her child vanish beneath the surface. She ran toward the lake, her face frozen in horror. David was already moving. He yanked off his jacket and sprinted toward the water. His mind went blank except for one thought: get to the boy. The lake, once so serene, suddenly felt like an enemy. The water was cold, the current stronger than it looked. David plunged in, his strong arms cutting through the surface as he searched for any sign of the child. For a terrifying moment, all he saw was darkness beneath the water. Then, a flash of red. David dove deeper, his lungs burning as he reached out, his fingers brushing against soft fabric. He grasped the boy's shirt and pulled him close to his chest, kicking hard toward the surface. Breaking through, he gasped for air, holding the boy's head above the water. Tyler coughed and sputtered, his small hands clutching at David's soaked shirt in desperation. "Hold on, kid," David murmured, his own heart pounding. The shore still felt far, and the current was dragging them sideways. "Mommy." Tyler's voice was barely a whimper against the water. Beth was at the shore, screaming for her son, trying to run into the water, but a bystander held her back. David's arms ached as he swam, fighting the pull of the lake. Tyler's grip on him weakened, and for a horrifying moment, the child slipped slightly from his grasp. "No, no, no, stay with me," David gasped, tightening his hold. He pushed harder, his body screaming in protest as he forced them closer to shore. Finally, his feet touched the lake bottom. Hands reached out for Tyler, pulling him to safety. As soon as they were on solid ground, Beth collapsed to her knees, cradling her son, sobbing into his wet hair. David sat back in the sand, chest heaving, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. Beth turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "You saved him. You saved my baby. I don't even know how to thank you." David shook his head, brushing off the gratitude. Just glad he's safe." Around them, People murmured about calling an ambulance. Others patted David on the back, calling him a hero. But he barely heard them. His mind was still in the water, still fighting the current. Then a small voice broke through his thoughts. "Thank you," Tyler whispered, his voice hoarse. David looked down at the boy, who was still clinging to his mother. Tyler's big brown eyes met his, filled with pure gratitude. David swallowed hard. He wasn't used to receiving thanks. He had always believed that helping others was just the right thing to do. But as he looked at Tyler, something inside him shifted. A debt never forgotten. Years passed, and the memory of that fateful day at the lake remained vivid in Beth's mind. Every time she looked at Tyler, now a young man full of life, she couldn't help but remember how close she had come to losing him. And how, if not for David Carter, she would have. David, however, had never asked for anything in return. He had been his usual quiet, humble self, brushing off praise as though he had simply done what anyone else would. He had left the scene that day as soon as he was sure Tyler was safe, never one to bask in the spotlight. But Beth had never forgotten, and neither had Tyler. Tyler had grown up hearing the story of how a stranger had saved his life. Beth had told it to him when he was old enough to understand, but even before then, he had always felt a deep connection to David. As he grew, so did his admiration for the man. He wanted to be like him, strong, selfless, and brave. Tyler wasn't the only one who noticed David's quiet presence over the years. Though he lived alone on the outskirts of town, he was never completely out of sight. He worked odd jobs, fixed broken fences for neighbors without being asked, and always seemed to be around when someone needed help. But he also carried an air of solitude. No wife, no children, no family to call his own. Beth always wondered what kind of life he had led before settling in Crestwood. What had made him the way he was? Tyler, now in his early 20s, had gone off to college, but he never stopped thinking about David. He would visit during school breaks, always making a point to check in on him. He'd find an excuse, bringing over homemade cookies from his mother, asking for help with a car issue, or just dropping by to say hello. David always welcomed him, though he never made a big deal of it. He would grunt a greeting, offer a chair, and pour Tyler a cup of coffee, even though Tyler had never acquired a taste for it. They never spoke about the rescue. It was unspoken between them, a bond neither had to explain. Then, one winter evening, everything changed. A cry for help. Beth was the one who received the call. It was from a neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, who lived down the street from David. "Beth, it's David. I'm worried about him." The frail voice on the other end of the line trembled with concern. "He hasn't been out of his house in days. I usually see him early in the morning, but now, I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." Beth's stomach twisted into knots. David was a man of habit. If he hadn't been seen for days, something was definitely wrong. Without hesitation, she called Tyler. Tyler, now a medical student in his final year of training, answered immediately. "Mom, what's wrong?" Beth's voice was rushed. "It's David. No one's seen him in days. His neighbor called me. She's worried." Tyler didn't even hesitate. "I'm on my way." Less than 15 minutes later, Tyler was speeding through the familiar streets of Crestwood, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind raced with possibilities. Was he hurt? Sick? Had something happened? When he finally pulled up to David's small one-story home, he immediately noticed something was off. The lights were off, and the front porch was covered in newspapers and old mail. David never let things pile up. Tyler parked the car and ran up the steps, knocking hard on the door. "David?" No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "David, it's Tyler. Open up." Nothing. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. A life in ruins. The air was stale, thick with neglect. The house was in disarray. Clothes were strewn across the couch, unopened bills littered the coffee table, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat next to an untouched plate of food. But what truly made Tyler's breath catch was David himself. He was slumped in an old armchair, his body looking thinner than Tyler remembered. His hair was disheveled, his once sharp eyes clouded with exhaustion. He had always been lean, but now he looked frail. There were dark circles under his eyes, his skin was pale, and his hands shook slightly even as he lifted them to his face when he saw Tyler standing there. "What the hell happened to you?" Tyler asked, his voice both soft and urgent. David let out a weak chuckle. "Nice to see you too, kid." Tyler wasn't amused. He stepped forward, kneeling beside the chair. "David, seriously, when was the last time you ate something?" David waved a dismissive hand. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Tyler could see it now. Dehydration, malnutrition, possible illness. His medical training kicked in as he analyzed the signs. His gut twisted. Beth had been right to be worried. "Let me help you," Tyler said, his voice steady but firm. "Let me take you to the hospital." David's eyes hardened. "I don't need a damn hospital. You can barely sit up straight." David clenched his jaw. "I've been through worse." Tyler sat back, exhaling sharply. He knew he was dealing with a man who had spent his life taking care of others, but had never learned how to accept help himself. "Fine," Tyler said after a long pause. "Then let me do something. Let me at least stay for a while." David gave him a long look, his defenses still up. But after a moment, he sighed and nodded. "All right," he muttered. "But just for a bit." Tyler knew better. This wasn't just a visit. David needed him. And this time, Tyler wasn't leaving. The beginning of a new battle. Over the next few days, Tyler stayed by David's side. He forced him to drink water, made him eat small meals, and cleaned up the house little by little. David resisted at first, but eventually, he gave in. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, David finally spoke. "I lost my job months ago," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Didn't tell anyone. Thought I could handle it. Thought I could get back on my feet." Tyler stayed quiet, letting him talk. But one thing led to another. Bills piled up. I couldn't keep up. I started skipping meals to save money. Figured it was temporary. Then, I just didn't care anymore. Tyler clenched his fists. He had always seen David as strong, unbreakable. But now he saw something else. A man who had spent his entire life saving others, but had never learned how to save himself. "You should have called me," Tyler said quietly. David let out a bitter laugh. "Why?" "So I could be your charity case." "No," Tyler said, meeting his gaze. "Because you're family." David flinched at the word. Family. He had never thought of himself that way. He had spent years on the outside, never allowing himself to get too close. But here was Tyler, the boy he had saved all those years ago, now sitting beside him, refusing to let him fall. "I don't know how to accept help," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Tyler's expression softened. "Then let me teach you." For the first time in a long time, David felt something shift in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do this alone. The long road to healing. David had always prided himself on his independence. He had built a life on self-reliance, on never needing anyone. He had survived war, loss, and loneliness, always finding a way to keep moving forward. But now, for the first time in his life, he was forced to admit something he had never dared to before. He couldn't do this alone. Tyler had settled into David's home like a force of nature, quiet but unyielding. He never pushed too hard, never forced conversations that David wasn't ready for, but he also never left. He cooked, cleaned, and made sure David ate, subtly reintroducing structure into a life that had been unraveling for months. At first, David resisted. "You're fussing over me like I'm some damn child. he grumbled one morning as Tyler set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. Tyler arched a brow. "You want to prove you're not. Eat your food." David glared at him, but picked up his fork. He didn't have the energy to argue. Each day, Tyler chipped away at the walls David had built around himself. He didn't treat David like a patient or a charity case. He treated him like family. And that was something David didn't know how to handle. The weight of the past. The nightmares came first. They always did when David wasn't keeping busy enough. The past clawed its way back into his mind the moment he closed his eyes, dragging him down into memories he had tried for years to suppress. Gunfire. Smoke. The weight of a dying soldier in his arms. David woke up in a cold sweat, his breath ragged, his hands clenched into fists. He sat up, running a trembling hand through his graying hair, trying to steady himself. He wasn't in the desert anymore. He wasn't back there. He was home, but home had never felt safe. Bad dream. David turned sharply to see Tyler standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with quiet understanding. David exhaled slowly. Something like that. Tyler didn't press. He just nodded and stepped inside, handing David a bottle of water before sitting in the chair beside the bed. "You used to have them a lot when I was a kid," Tyler said after a moment. David blinked at him. "You remember that?" Tyler gave a half smile. "Yeah, I'd stop by to visit, and sometimes I'd hear you in your room. You always told me it was nothing." David looked away. "Didn't think you noticed." "I did." A heavy silence filled the room, thick with unspoken things. David took a slow sip of water, gathering his thoughts. "You ever have nightmares?" he asked finally. Tyler hesitated before answering. "Yeah," he admitted. "Not the same as yours, I'm sure. But med school was rough. Long nights, lost a few patients that stuck with me. Some things just don't leave you." David nodded. He knew that feeling all too well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tyler said something that surprised him. "Talking about it helps." David scoffed. "That's some doctor wisdom you picked up." Tyler smirked. "That and common sense." David thought about that. Maybe Tyler was right. Maybe keeping everything bottled up had only made things worse. But talking, he wasn't sure if he remembered how. The first step forward. The next morning, Tyler was in the kitchen making coffee when David walked in, looking like he hadn't slept much. "Thought you left," David muttered, rubbing his temples. Tyler scoffed. "Yeah, right. Like I'd leave you alone in this mess." David huffed but didn't argue. Instead, he sat down at the table, watching as Tyler poured him a cup of coffee. "Look," Tyler said, setting the cup down in front of him. "I know this isn't easy. I know you hate the idea of needing help, but I'm not going anywhere. So either we sit here in silence and act like everything's fine, or you can tell me what's actually going on." David stared at him, his fingers tightening around the mug. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled. "I lost my job in Denver a year ago," he admitted. "Tried to find something else, but things just kept piling up. Rent, bills. I stopped trying after a while. Figured if I just kept my head down, it'd sort itself out. But it didn't." Tyler nodded, not interrupting. David sighed, staring into his coffee. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this. Weak. Pathetic." Tyler shook his head. "You're not weak, David." David let out a dry laugh. "Doesn't feel that way." "You think being strong means doing everything alone?" Tyler asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because if that's the case, then I guess I was never strong, huh?" David frowned. "That's not. I needed help to get where I am today," Tyler interrupted. "I had my mom, my professors, my mentors, and I had you." David's chest tightened. "You saved my life, David. More than once. Not just that day at the lake, but all the days after. Every time you showed up, every time you taught me something. You saved me. And now, it's my turn to save you." David clenched his jaw, his emotions warring inside him. Tyler leaned forward. "But I can't do that if you don't let me in." David looked at him, really looked at him. The boy he had once pulled from the lake was now a man who refused to let him drown. And for the first time in a long time, David allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this alone. A new beginning. Over the next few weeks, things started to change. It was slow at first. Tyler helped David set up a budget, helped him find local veteran support programs, and even convinced him to go to a few community events. David still struggled with accepting help, but with each passing day, he resisted less. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, Tyler handed David a small envelope. David raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Tyler grinned. "Just open it." David did, pulling out a folded piece of paper, his brow furrowed as he read it. It was a job offer. Veterans Outreach Program, Tyler explained. They need someone to help run it. Someone with experience. Someone like you. David stared at the paper, his throat tightening. "You think I can do this?" he asked after a long moment. Tyler smiled. "I know you can." David exhaled slowly, something shifting inside him. For years, he had been lost, drowning in his own silence. But now, as he looked at the offer in his hands, at the young man sitting beside him, the boy he had saved, who had now come back to save him, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living again. The price of redemption. David sat in his small kitchen, staring at the letter Tyler had handed him. The words on the page blurred together, not because his eyesight was failing, but because he couldn't quite process the reality of it. A job offer. Not just any job. A role helping other veterans, men and women like him, struggling to reintegrate into society. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper. For years, David had convinced himself that his usefulness had long passed, that the best thing he could do for the world was to fade quietly into the background. But now, here was proof that maybe, just maybe, he still had something left to give. "You don't have to decide right now," Tyler said, breaking the silence. "Just think about it." David's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to reject it outright. He wasn't the right person for something like this. He could barely keep his own life together. How could he possibly help anyone else? But deep down, a small voice whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. "You don't have to do this alone." That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had spent so much of his life pulling others from the wreckage, never realizing that one day, someone would have to pull him from his own. Tyler had given him an outstretched hand. The question was he brave enough to take it? The first step forward. A week later, David found himself standing outside the Crestwood Veterans Resource Center, gripping the job offer letter so tightly in his hands that it had wrinkled beyond recognition. He had spent days arguing with himself over whether to come. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he failed? What if? "Mr. Carter." David blinked and turned. A woman in her early 40s stood in the doorway, smiling warmly at him. She had dark brown hair streaked with silver and kind eyes that held an understanding he recognized immediately. She was one of them. "I'm Laura Stevenson." She introduced herself. "Director of the Outreach Program. You must be Tyler's friend." David nodded stiffly. She didn't push. She simply extended her hand. "Come on inside. We can talk." Inside, the center was buzzing with activity. Veterans of all ages sat in small groups, some deep in conversation, others lost in thought. A bulletin board listed local job postings, housing assistance, and mental health resources. For the first time in years, David felt something shift in his chest. This place was built for people like him. Laura led him into a small office, offering him a chair. "I know Tyler spoke to you about the position," she said, leaning forward. "But before we talk about that, I just want to hear your story. David hesitated, unused to talking about himself. I served in the 82nd Airborne, he said eventually. 2 tours overseas. Came back, got a regular job, tried to fit back into civilian life. He paused, his fingers tightening around his knees. Didn't work out so well. Laura nodded knowingly. It rarely does. David glanced at her. You served. Marines, she said with a small smile. Spent years trying to find my footing after coming home. Eventually, I realized the only way to heal was to help others heal. David exhaled. I don't know if I'm the right man for this job. Laura leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Why not? He hesitated. Because I don't have my life together. Because I've spent too long trying to disappear. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You know, I've been running this place for over a decade, she said finally. And do you know who the best mentors have been? David shook his head. The ones who understand the struggle, Laura said simply. The ones who've been in the trenches, not just in war, but in life. David swallowed hard. Look, I won't force you to take this job, she said, her voice gentle but firm. But I will say this, you still have something to offer. More than you realize. David sat there, his mind racing. Could he really do this? Then he thought about Tyler. About how the boy he had once saved had now grown into a man who refused to let him fade away. Maybe it was time to return the favor. Slowly, he nodded. I'll give it a shot. Facing the demons. Taking the job was the easy part. The hard part was facing the ghosts of his past. The first few days at the center were overwhelming. Each conversation he had with the veterans there forced him to confront pieces of himself he had long buried. One afternoon, he sat across from a younger man named Nate, who had only been back from deployment for a few months. Nate's hands shook as he spoke. I don't sleep. I don't know how to be normal anymore. It's like, I came back, but part of me is still there. David's chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well. You're not broken, David said finally. You're just carrying too much weight on your own. Nate exhaled sharply, his eyes glassy. You ever get past it? David was silent for a long moment before answering. You don't get past it, he admitted. You learn how to live with it. Nate nodded, as if those words carried more truth than anything else he had heard. David realized then that he wasn't just helping others. He was healing, too. A new purpose. Months passed. David had found something he hadn't realized he needed. A purpose. He spent his days working with veterans, helping them find jobs, housing, and therapy. He helped organize group meetings, offering quiet support to those who had once felt just as lost as he had. But the biggest change came inside him. The loneliness that had once consumed him wasn't so heavy anymore. He had people who relied on him, friends who understood him, and he had Tyler. One evening, Tyler stopped by the center after his hospital shift. He leaned against the doorway, watching David as he helped an older veteran with paperwork. When the man left, Tyler smirked. You look like a real professional, old man. David rolled his eyes. I'm not that old. Tyler chuckled. Beth and I were talking. We want you over for dinner this weekend. David hesitated. He had spent so long keeping himself at a distance from people. But that distance was disappearing, little by little. He nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. Tyler grinned. Good. Mom's making pot roast. David chuckled. That woman makes a mean pot roast. As Tyler left, David sat back in his chair, letting the warmth of the moment settle over him. For years, he had believed he had nothing left to offer. But now, surrounded by people who needed him, by a family that had never stopped caring, he realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was finally living. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The price of redemption. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, David began to feel like himself again. Working at the Crestwood Veterans Resource Center had become more than just a job. It was a lifeline. Each day, he met men and women who carried their own burdens, their own scars, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. But he wasn't healed yet. The nightmares still came. Some nights, they were so bad that David would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the sound of distant gunfire ringing in his ears. The walls of his small home felt too close, too suffocating, and he would sit on the edge of his bed, gripping his knees, reminding himself that he was safe. That was when Tyler's phone number became his safety net. The first time David called in the middle of the night, he had almost hung up, but Tyler answered immediately. "David." His voice was groggy but alert. David exhaled heavily. "Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. You think I care about sleep?" Tyler's voice softened. "Talk to me." David hesitated. For years, he had handled everything alone. No one had ever asked him to share his pain, to let someone else carry a piece of the weight. But Tyler wasn't just anyone. "I keep seeing them," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones I couldn't save." Tyler was silent for a moment, and then he spoke without judgment. "I get it," he said. "I see faces too. The ones I lost in the ER. The ones I couldn't save in time. It doesn't go away, David, but it doesn't have to own you either." David closed his eyes, Tyler's words sinking deep into his chest. "How do you live with it?" David finally asked. There was a pause before Tyler answered. "I remind myself of the ones I did save," he said. "Like you did for me." David's throat tightened. For so long, he had only seen the ones he had failed. But Tyler was living proof that he had made a difference, and maybe that had to be enough. Falling into routine. Over the next few months, David built a new life. It wasn't easy. Some days were better than others. Some days, the memories still clawed at him, dragging him back into the past. But he wasn't drowning anymore. He woke up with purpose. He went to work, talked to veterans who were just like him, and found solace in their shared struggles. One afternoon, he sat across from a young woman named Claire, a former Army medic who had returned home only 6 months ago. "I don't know how to be normal," she admitted, staring at the floor. "I wake up expecting the worst. I feel useless, like I don't belong here." David knew those feelings too well. "I used to think that too," he said, leaning forward. "But the truth is, normal doesn't exist. Not for people like us." Claire met his gaze, searching for answers. "So what do we do?" she asked. David exhaled. "We build something new." Claire was quiet for a long time, and then, for the first time since she had walked into the center, she nodded. David knew then that he was doing something that mattered, not just for others, but for himself. An unexpected setback. Just when things were starting to feel stable, everything fell apart. It started with a letter. David had just finished locking up the center when he found the official-looking envelope sitting in his mailbox. His stomach twisted as he tore it open. It was a notice of eviction. Final warning. Failure to pay outstanding amount. Wailwaries ult enforced deed vacancy within 30 days. David's hands trembled. He knew he had fallen behind on payments before taking the job at the center, but he thought he had time to catch up. He was wrong. That night, he sat alone in his darkened house, the eviction notice on the table in front of him. For the first time in months, the weight of failure pressed down on him again. He had fought so hard to rebuild his life, but it was never enough. And for the first time since Tyler had come back into his life, David didn't call him. Because this wasn't something Tyler could fix. A friend's loyalty. Tyler noticed immediately when something was wrong. David stopped answering his calls. He missed their usual weekend breakfast at the diner. He even skipped his shift at the resource center, something he never did. So Tyler did what he always did when David shut him out. He showed up. It was late when he knocked on David's door. No answer. Tyler frowned. "David, open up." Still nothing. Without hesitation, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. Tyler stepped inside and immediately knew something was wrong. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. A bottle of whiskey sat beside him, still full, but the fact that it was even there was enough to raise alarm bells. Tyler's stomach clenched. What's going on? David didn't look up. He simply pushed the letter across the table. Tyler picked it up, his eyes scanning the words. His jaw tightened. You should have told me, Tyler said, his voice calm but firm. David exhaled through his nose. Why? So you could swoop in and save me again. Tyler sat down across from him. You're damn right I would, he said. David finally met his gaze, his expression filled with frustration. I don't want to be your problem, Tyler. You're not my problem, Tyler shot back. You're my family, and family doesn't get to suffer alone. David's throat tightened. The truth was, part of him had expected this to happen. He had spent so many years believing he didn't deserve stability, that any good thing in his life would eventually fall apart. But now, here was Tyler, refusing to let that happen, and David didn't know how to handle that. I can't ask you to fix this, David said quietly. You're not asking, Tyler said. I'm offering. David swallowed hard. And what happens when you get tired of bailing me out? Tyler shook his head. You think this is charity. This is what people do when they care. David looked down, his hands clenched into fists. All his life, he had pushed people away, believing that if he needed them too much, they would leave. But Tyler hadn't left. And maybe, just maybe, he never would. A plan for the future. The next day, Tyler took action. He called Beth, and together, they gathered the community. David had spent years helping others. Now it was time for the town to help him. By the end of the week, the eviction notice was gone. The house was saved. But more than that, David realized something important. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. The test of loyalty. David had never been one to rely on others. For most of his life, he had been the one offering help, not accepting it. But now, as he stood in his small home, looking at the faces of Tyler, Beth, and half the town of Crestwood, he realized that his world had changed. People weren't here to pity him. They were here because they cared. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't fight it. But just when he thought things were finally settling down, a new storm arrived. And this time, David wasn't the one who needed saving. An unexpected call. It was late one evening when David's phone rang. He had just finished another shift at the Veterans Resource Center, tired but content, when the number flashed across his screen. Beth. A chill ran down his spine. Beth never called this late. He answered immediately. Beth. Her voice was shaky, frantic. It's Tyler. David's heart dropped. What happened? He collapsed at work, Beth said, her voice breaking. They rushed him to the ER. I don't know what's wrong, David. They won't tell me anything. David was already grabbing his coat. I'm on my way. A race against time. The hospital hallways felt too familiar. David had spent too many nights in places like this, watching doctors and nurses rush past him, feeling powerless. But this was different. This was Tyler. He found Beth pacing outside the ICU, her hands shaking as she wrung them together. The moment she saw David, she broke down. They won't tell me anything, she whispered. They just said, it's serious. David placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. We're going to find out, he said, his voice calm but firm. Just then, a doctor walked toward them, looking exhausted but professional. Beth immediately stepped forward. My son, please, tell me what's wrong. The doctor sighed, flipping through his chart. Tyler suffered a cardiac event at work, he explained. We've stabilized him, but he's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and his stress levels were dangerously high. David's stomach clenched. Beth shook her head. But that doesn't make sense. He's young. He's healthy. The doctor hesitated. Has he been under a lot of pressure lately? David and Beth exchanged a look. Of course he had. Tyler had been holding up David, supporting the Veterans Center, working insane hours at the hospital. He had been so busy helping everyone else that he hadn't been taking care of himself. Beth's eyes filled with tears. I should have noticed. David felt a surge of guilt, but he forced it down. This wasn't about blame. This was about getting Tyler through this. Can we see him? David asked. The doctor nodded. Only for a few minutes. Seeing the unbreakable fall. David had seen strong men broken before. But seeing Tyler, the boy he had once saved, the man who had saved him, lying in that hospital bed, pale and weak, hit him harder than any battlefield ever had. Beth sat beside Tyler, stroking his hair. Sweetheart, she whispered. I'm here. Tyler's eyes fluttered open. He looked exhausted, drained, fragile. But when he saw David, a small, tired smirk appeared. Didn't think I'd be the one in the hospital, huh? David huffed a quiet laugh, sitting beside him. Not exactly how I pictured things. Tyler swallowed, glancing at his mother. Mom, you should go get some rest. Beth hesitated, then looked at David. I'll stay with him, David said immediately. Beth gave Tyler's hand a squeeze, then reluctantly left the room. Once they were alone, David leaned forward. Tyler. His voice was firm but gentle. What the hell were you thinking? Tyler sighed. I thought I could handle it. David clenched his fists. You almost died. Tyler didn't argue. He just looked at David with those same eyes he had as a child, full of quiet trust. I couldn't let you go through everything alone, Tyler admitted. You needed me. David's chest tightened. You don't get to say that, David said, his voice rough with emotion. Not when it nearly cost you your damn life. Tyler chuckled weakly. You sound like a parent. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe that's because I feel like one. Silence settled between them. Then Tyler's voice softened. You saved me first. David swallowed hard. Yeah, well, I didn't do it, so you could kill yourself working yourself to death. Tyler smiled tiredly. Guess I need to learn to accept help too. David smirked. Now that's something I can teach you. For the first time since stepping into the hospital, he saw it. A flicker of hope. The recovery plan. Tyler's doctors insisted he take at least 2 months off work. At first, Tyler fought it. Then David laid down the law. You're taking time off, David said firmly. No arguments. Tyler groaned. You're getting bossy in your old age. David smirked. Dan right. Beth, of course, took over most of Tyler's recovery plan, but David made sure he had a say in it. For weeks, he stayed by Tyler's side, just as Tyler had stayed by his. He cooked for him, checked his vitals, made sure he actually rested. It was role reversal at its finest. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, Tyler gave David a knowing look. You never left. David sipped his coffee. Nope. Tyler smirked. I thought you hated asking for help. David chuckled. I do. Tyler raised a brow. David sighed. But I'm learning. Tyler grinned. About time. David rolled his eyes but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at his lips. Because for the first time in years, he realized something. Saving someone wasn't just about pulling them from the water. It was about being there afterward. And now, he and Tyler were even. Full circle. A few weeks later, as Tyler's strength returned, David took him to a familiar place. Lake Avalon. The water shimmered under the sun, just as it had all those years ago. Tyler sat beside David on the dock, their legs dangling over the edge. You know, Tyler mused, I always wondered what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day. David's jaw tightened. I don't like thinking about that. Tyler nodded. Me neither. A long silence stretched between them. Then David spoke, his voice rough but honest. I think saving you that day might have saved me too. Tyler turned to him, his eyes searching David's. You mean that? David exhaled, looking out at the water. Yeah, because if he hadn't saved Tyler, then maybe Tyler wouldn't have come back all those years later. Maybe David would have been lost forever. And maybe that day by the lake hadn't just been about saving a boy. Maybe it had been about saving two lives at once. Tyler smiled. Then I guess we're both lucky. David smirked. Guess so. The water lapped gently against the dock, the sun setting behind them. For the first time in a long time, David felt at peace. And this time, he wasn't standing alone. The legacy of kindness. The lake shimmered under the golden hues of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the dock where David and Tyler sat side by side. The past lingered between them, woven into the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden planks, into the wind that carried the faint echoes of childhood laughter and long-forgotten summer days. For years, this place had symbolized one moment, a desperate rescue, a life saved. But now, as David and Tyler sat in companionable silence, it was clear that the impact of that day had rippled outward in ways neither of them had ever imagined. It had been more than a rescue. It had been the beginning of something far greater. The next chapter. Tyler had returned to work after his mandated rest period, but things had changed. He no longer worked insane hours. He no longer ignored his own health in favor of helping others. He had finally learned to set boundaries, not because he wanted to do less, but because he finally understood that he couldn't save others if he didn't take care of himself. And David was the one who held him to that promise. Are you drinking enough water? David asked, arms crossed as he sat in Tyler's kitchen one morning. Tyler, standing at the coffee maker, sighed. Yes, Dad. David smirked. Dan right. Tyler rolled his eyes but smiled as he poured himself a glass of water alongside his coffee. Somehow, their roles had shifted and balanced over time. David had once been the one rescuing Tyler. Then Tyler had become the one saving David. But now, they had become something else entirely. Family. A new beginning for David. The Veterans Resource Center was thriving under David's guidance. What had once been just a job had become a mission, one that gave him purpose, one that made him feel needed in ways he hadn't in years. Laura, the director, leaned against his office door one afternoon, smiling as she watched him go over paperwork. You know, she mused, I think you were meant for this job. David snorted. I think you just needed someone stubborn enough to take it. Laura chuckled. Maybe. But I also think you're doing something important here. David leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. I just know what it feels like to be lost. To think no one's coming for you. Laura nodded. That's why you're the right man for this. David didn't argue. For the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. A family grows. Beth had always been a mother to Tyler first. But over time, David realized she had also become something of a mother to him too. One Sunday evening, as David walked into Beth's house for their usual family dinner, she greeted him at the door with a stern look. You've lost weight again, she said, hands on her hips. David blinked. Sit down, she ordered. You're eating extra tonight. David knew better than to argue. Over the months, Sunday dinners had become his favorite part of the week. Beth cooked, Tyler complained about work, and David felt like he belonged in a way he hadn't for years. Little Lily, Tyler's 5-year-old daughter, had especially taken to him. She was curious, sharp, and fearless, just like Tyler had been. Grandpa David, look what I made, she exclaimed, running up to him after dinner, a crayon drawing clutched in her tiny hands. David took the paper, his breath catching. It was a drawing of him, Tyler, and Lily standing together under the big oak tree in Beth's backyard. At the top she had written in careful, wobbly letters, My family. David swallowed the lump in his throat. Lily looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "Do you like it?" David knelt down, wrapping her in a hug. "I love it, sweetheart." And he meant it. Because for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had a place where he belonged. An unfinished legacy. One summer afternoon, David and Tyler returned to Lake Avalon. But this time, they weren't alone. Lily ran ahead of them, her tiny feet kicking up the warm sand. David smiled as he watched her, carefree, full of life, just like Tyler had once been. Tyler, standing beside him, nudged him with his elbow. "You know, you started all of this." David huffed. "What are you talking about?" "If you hadn't saved me that day," Tyler said softly, "none of this would exist." David exhaled, looking out at the water. "I don't know about that," he murmured. But Tyler shook his head. "I do." David thought about everything that had happened, the rescue, the years of silence, the moment Tyler had come back for him. He had once believed that his actions that day at the lake had ended when he pulled a little boy from the water. But now, standing here with Tyler beside him and Lily playing in the sand, he realized that the moment had never really ended. The ripples had continued outward, shaping not just Tyler's life, but his own. "You ever think about the people you save?" Tyler asked. "Wonder what happens to them after?" David nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." Tyler smiled. "Well, now you know." David looked at him, feeling something in his chest settle. Maybe he had spent years lost, wandering. Maybe he had spent too long believing that he had nothing left to offer. But now, looking at Tyler, at Lily, at the family that had never given up on him, he knew one thing for certain. His story wasn't over. His legacy of kindness would live on. Not because of the past, but because of the future he was still building. And for the first time in a long time, David finally understood. He had been saved too. Epilogue. A full circle moment. Years later, a plaque was installed at Lake Avalon. A simple inscription. "In honor of the man who saved a life and built a family. David Carter. A hero, a mentor, a friend." Standing before it, David felt no need for recognition. He had never done any of this for praise. But as Lily, now older, held his hand, he realized something. This wasn't just a plaque. It was proof that his life had mattered. And in the end, that was more than he had ever dared to hope for. Because kindness never truly fades. It ripples outward, forever changing the world. And David Carter, the man who had once been lost, had finally found his way home.